webinar is an hour long. I'll set the context of the report and then introduce the speakers. The speakers will take roughly about 30 minutes to share the findings, and then we open the floor for discussions and questions. Some housekeeping rules before we begin. Please keep yourself muted. Send through any questions in the chat box. I'm viewing the chat box and will pass on the questions to the authors of the report. In case you face any technical challenges, please send us a message directly to CEEW webinar host. That's the name. Colleagues are there manning that account to help you. Resources from today's webinar will be available towards the end of the hour. The session is being recorded. Web links for the report and a data portal will be shared in the chat box towards the end of the discussion. Right then, before I begin, let me just acknowledge the circumstances. We want to acknowledge that we are organizing this webinar in extraordinary circumstances given the terrible impacts of COVID-19 on health and livelihoods in India. There are uncertain times ahead, and the first priority has to be health and helping people meet their essential needs. At the same time, the authors have been working hard to create this new data review of energy subsidies in India. And they believe that we cannot lose sight of ambition for a clean energy transition as we find our way out of this crisis. Right then, so let's begin. Some context before we start. Subsidies matter because they are used by governments around the world to influence energy producers and consumers. Subsidies can be intended to help achieve many policy goals, like energy access at affordable prices, meeting energy demand efficiently, balancing energy and security needs, and achieving a desired energy transition. In this light, India's energy policy sector is very dynamic, and the government's choices in supporting different fuels have impacts like on its clean energy commitments, impacts on air pollution, public health, and also impacts on energy access goals for its poorest. This webinar will examine how the government of India has used subsidies to support different types of energy, highlighting the most significant developments from 2014 to 2019. You can expect the speakers to talk about the latest trends in India's energy subsidies, what the most significant developments have been in India's dynamic energy policy environment. You can also expect to hear a bit about fossil fuel subsidy reform, help freeing up resources for economic recovery from COVID-19. And at any point, if you find the speakers are not talking enough about this, then please feel free to question them on it. With that, let me introduce the authors of the report. The first speaker is Christopher Beaton. He is a senior policy advisor and lead of the India program at IISD. The second speaker is Karthik Ganeshan. He's a research fellow at CEEW. The third speaker is Balasubramaniam Vishwanathan. He's an energy specialist and associate at IISD. And the other author of the report, Vibhuti Garg, she's online and she'll be available. So with that, let me hand over to Chris.
Very much, Shruti. I think I'll just start by reiterating the point you've already made, that it obviously isn't an easy time for India or the rest of the world right now. But we do think it's an important time to still keep talking about energy transition, particularly because a lot of government efforts to stimulate economic recovery is going to have big implications for the energy sector and touch on issues like energy subsidies. So we hope that this update of energy subsidies in India is going to share better data from the past 2 years that will help to inform discussions about what we might want to see happen in the next few months. With that said, maybe we could move to the next slide, and I'll just give a bit more background about IISD. So IISD is the International Institute for Sustainable Development, or international non-profit policy research institute. And we've been working on these issues now internationally for over 15 years through our Global Subsidies Initiative, the GSI. We don't think that subsidies are inherently good or bad, but we exist because in a lot of countries around the world, there are energy subsidies that are a problem and that are obstructing clean energy transition. It may be because the subsidies are expensive and they're taking up precious resources. It may be because they're actively undermining sustainability objectives, or it could be that they're achieving their objectives, but also having unintended side effects. So our goal in this work, and more generally, is to improve transparency on subsidy data, to promote informed discussion and debate and research on energy subsidies among policymakers and researchers, and also to promote socially just reform of fossil fuel subsidies. And as of the last few months, it is now also to think about what all of this means in the middle of the health and economic crisis created by COVID-19. So to the next slide, I think Kartik is going to say a few words about CEEW.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening to people wherever you are. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Great. I mean, it feels amazing to be able to sit here and present sitting in my pajamas, but I didn't think I'd ever be doing that with an audience across the world. I see a lot of familiar faces here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. As you know, CEEW is one of South Asia's leading policy research institutions, and this particular project that we've been engaging with IISD on over the last 2 years really spans many of our work programs. I specifically work in the power sector and industrial sustainability areas, and we've drawn on a lot of our expertise and experience in these two areas to help the IISD team sort of curate some of the numbers on energy subsidies that have been going across India. We started our work really, at some point many years ago with IISD, looking at energy subsidies. Shruti was one of our first collaborators on it. And we got interested in energy access in those areas, and all of these, as you can see, feature in work programs actively today. So in many ways, I think our starting point has been sort of subsidies and understanding how it actually has shaped the ecosystem here in India. More on that as I get to the presentation at a later point. Back to you, Chris. Yeah.
Great, thanks. So for the next slide, we'll start to jump into our data update. Next slide again. We'll start with a few quick words on our approach. So as Kartik mentioned, this data update is being created in partnership between IISD and CEEW. It's based on an underlying database that was initially created with ICF India and the Overseas Development Institute back in 2017. We use a WTO, a World Trade Organization, definition of subsidy, which includes direct and indirect transfers, foregone revenue, access to government goods and services below market prices, and forms of what we call price support, which would, for example, be laws that fix prices below market levels. This definition has been agreed by over 160 countries internationally, including India, and it's also being used as the basis for the formal methodology that the UN Environment Programme recently published in summer last year to guide countries on how they should track progress against SDG 12.C.1, in which countries are intended to report their efforts to reduce fossil fuel subsidies as a percentage of GDP as we move towards 2030. So in our database, we cover 5 main energy types or groups, which are on the slide before you: coal, oil and gas, electricity transmission and distribution, renewable energy, and electric vehicles. We could talk for a really long time about methodology, but we don't want to because it gets too detailed. But if you are interested to know more, full information on this is of course available in the study. So please check it out if you want any more info. So with all this introductory material aside, we can switch to the kind of key trends from the data update. We're going to switch to a short video now that we've produced that summarizes some of the findings. Since we're sharing the video via screen sharing, it might look a little bit choppy as you watch it, but do know that the full video has got a really great soundtrack song, which we'll have on mute, but sounds great. And it also looks really sharp. So if you find the video useful, please do share it with your networks, and we can share a link with you all at the end of the presentation for where you can find it. It's also circulated now on Twitter. So it looks like we're ready to go. So Shruti, could you press play? So our main changes in subsidies are as follows, and this is comparing 2017 to 2019 as our years of change. For oil and gas subsidies, we've seen a big resurgence. They're up by 65%. A lot of this was driven by higher oil prices, which has of course changed pretty recently, and we'll talk more on that later. And big growth in LPG consumption has also been a factor. For renewables, there's been a decrease, down by 35%. Part of this is good news. Renewable energy is just more competitive, so it's needing less subsidies. But in part, it's also a sectoral slowdown caused by policy decisions like the solar safeguard duty and price caps in auctions. Next group is transmission and distribution. These subsidies have increased somewhat, up 13%, but the major story here is that they're still just very high. And mostly this is because of big electricity price subsidies for residential and agricultural consumers in India. And we've got data that suggests the subsidies aren't well targeted. For coal, we've seen very small changes, just a 3% decrease since 2017. And in fact, these subsidies have been almost unchanged since 2014. This year, we went further and we compared the benefits from coal taxes and special charges with the costs of subsidies, air pollution, and GHG emissions, and we found a big net cost of coal for India, and more on that later. For electric vehicles, it can be a little hard to see these subsidies because they're so small, but the good news is that they have increased considerably, so over 11 times since 2017. The main point to flag is that they are still quite marginal, bearing in mind the target for 30% of new vehicle sales to be electric in India by 2030. Stepping back, I think it's really important to look at long-term trends from 2014, where we can see that India has made big shifts in flows of public finance away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy and electricity. Over this time, fossil fuel subsidies have gone down more than half, and renewable energy has increased over 3 times. So despite some of these changes in the past 2 years, bringing the fossil fuel subsidies up and the renewable energy subsidies down, the longer term trend is a pretty positive one. So if we switch to the next slide, going back to the PowerPoint, we just have a summary here for you that compares the relative magnitude of subsidies for these different energy groups in 2019. And I think a big takeaway from this is, despite the long-term shifts being positive, the past 2 years have been going in the wrong direction, and there's clearly still a lot of work that can be done to shift public financial flows to better support clean energy transition. The biggest beneficiaries of public support right now are electricity, followed by oil and gas, and then coal. If we go to the next slide, we just wanted to flag the point that the subsidies for fossil fuels are still over 7 times larger than subsidies for alternative energy. And I think it's important to flag that that really large chunk you saw on the last slide of electricity subsidies isn't included in this kind of factoid. So electricity is obviously a carrier. It's not necessarily fossil fuels or renewable. So we've not included it. But right now, India's electricity mix is very fossil intensive. So this just underscores the importance of renewables even more. Because as renewables increase in the share of the mix, we'll see the extent to which those electricity subsidies are fossil or renewable shifting. So that's it in terms of the main data updates. I'll hand over now to Kartik and then Bala, who will talk about what some of this might mean in the midst of the current health and economic crisis.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris, for taking us through the quick numbers and findings. Shruti, can we move to the next slide as well? Yeah, great. So we get into the key themes of the discussion, sort of the drivers for what exactly we wanted to understand when we got into the study. As with each year that we've done this assessment, I think the themes have more or less remained the same, but it's just that they've been accentuated in this health and economic crisis that we're seeing. I think the lasting image for this current crisis will be what I saw of all of these migrants, being packed like sardines in those buses and having to walk, hundreds of kilometers back home. And the gross inequity that the system is sort of, entrenched over the years is really evident. And, energy subsidies are a big part of that as well. So if I look at the overall impact, right, I'm looking at revenue requirement. So if I look at where is the government going to get the revenues to actually stimulate the economy in this current climate? That is a big challenge. And we're saying that subsidies can really open up, right, that big box for the government to tap into if they can target it better. There's also this big question of how will the government make it more affordable, right? That's another big aspect that we're looking at. We'll get into the details in the next slide. Because as we said, there's cornering of subsidy on part of many consumers, whether it's electricity, whether it's LPG and natural gas, which we think can actually be addressed. And finally, if we do end up sort of saving on subsidies, and if we rationalize what we give out to different population segments, what does it actually mean for where we can target that, right? And what the actual benefits are that we can have in the longer term. That's what we're going to explore. So next slide, please. So we'll first look at the subsidies that come in from oil and gas, right? So one thing that needs to be stated very clearly, right, is that government of India is sort of distorting prices across the board when it comes to fossil fuels in general and energy as a whole as well. So a lot of these subsidies are actually made available because they tax all of these fuels inordinately as well. The problem is that this tax is then given out, right, in almost without testing for means, and as a result, it ends up going to different places, where it shouldn't be. So if you look at it, overall, the impact has been that because oil prices have been sort of decreasing over the period from 2014 through 19, the government has been mopping up a lot of tax revenues, and they've also not had to give out that much subsidy. It sort of started changing somewhere in 2017 when the prices bottomed out and then started growing back up again in the lead up to the crisis. And of course, now they are, seem to be in a tailspin. Right? So there's a very, very big opportunity out here for the government to actually sort of take the low prices and actually do something properly with it. So over the years, right, what you will also see is that there's been a lot of changes in the system in terms of, diesel has been deregulated. LPG subsidy has been no more direct benefit right now. So they've weeded out a lot of double connections and, illegal claims on the system. Kerosene sort of been phased out gradually as well. So all of those things are great developments, but the measure of how good the subsidy dispersal is still dependent on what the oil price is. Right? And that's why we think that India needs to take more control of this narrative and ensure that prices are transmitted to the people, irrespective of what the global oil price. Over to the next slide, please. So in the next slide, we discuss what exactly does the current situation bode for the system itself. As we said, the prices seem to have bottomed out. They may sort of be stabilizing at this current level, given the consensus that's happening out there among the producers. But nevertheless, these are unprecedented prices. The government must take control of the situation by doing two things. One, they've already gone ahead and increased the excise duty on petrol and diesel to fund relief, so to say, fund for COVID itself. It will be directed towards that, is what the government says, which is a fantastic, I think, idea. And more importantly, it also means that they don't actually have to subsidize as many consumers now, because the low oil prices already mean that some of the prices remain at levels that people were used to, albeit at higher oil prices. So this is a fantastic opportunity for government to sort of really pass through full prices, tax the system, collect revenue, and all of it basically means that you've got left more in the treasury, right, to spend on so many things that are currently being asked of from the government, on better health systems, on cleaner energy systems, and as a result, and also maybe direct cash transfer to a lot of people, as is being suggested by a lot of economists in the middle of the crisis itself. So fantastic opportunity for India to really, sow the seeds for that transition itself. Over to the next slide, please. And it's very important for energy access as well. So as we said, one of the things that we observe every year when we do the subsidy is that subsidies again and again seem to be going to people who are the haves, right? So as we jokingly said, right, each one of us in the India team who worked on this, right, is a beneficiary of a subsidy from Delhi government, right? We surely don't deserve it. That's because the electricity that we consume is at a subsidized rate in Delhi. Right? Similarly, when you look at electricity, when you look at LPG, we found earlier and many years ago in a research piece that the top 30 percentile of the population corners up to 50% of the overall subsidy. Whereas the bottom half, which is really just coming into the fold of LPG connection right now, is getting a much smaller share of it. But nevertheless, with increasing sort of shares of people coming into the fold of formal energy, the outlay for government is going to increase. But there is definitely an inequity and an access element to it. What we find is that a large chunk of the subsidies really are to promote electricity and cooking energy, but the problem is that they're not targeted right now. And if we don't find a better way of targeting this subsidy outlay will likely remain. Right? That massive number that we saw, that 72,000 crores that every year the governments are basically putting out there, is really into a black box where they're not addressing the systemic failures in the electricity system, but they're just sort of covering up for the inefficiencies that the system inherently has. So this, we think, needs to be addressed on a war footing. Over to the next slide. Transition's a little slow, pardon me. Yeah. And finally, I think, what does all of this mean in terms of the positive aspects? As Chris rightly mentioned, the subsidies for renewable energy remain kind of abysmally low, given that, across the world, it's sort of reached a point where competing head and shoulders with coal and other forms of energy. But nevertheless, we see that over the years, it sort of tended to rise because there was a massive buildup of capacity. Because of the fact that in the last 2 years, the introduction of the Somebody's got their system on.
I'm going to try and mute that person.
Sorry about this, folks. We'll have to wait for that to sort out. Okay, great. Can everybody hear me clearly now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as we were saying, because of because of the taxes that have been installed, sort of put in place by India, the safeguard duties on solar panels coming in from China and other countries have increased the cost of solar in some sense to the developers. We see that there's been a drop off in the pace of sort of creation of new assets, and notwithstanding the other challenges of risks associated with selling to discoms. But as a result of that, we see that the subsidy outlay itself to renewable energy has come down. So that's sort of more a trend that the industry is seeing, not necessarily the fact that India is supporting, or there's no notional decrease to renewable energy itself, because India still continues to go forward in its target of 100 gigawatt by 2022. But what we really need to ensure is that the subsidies don't just remain for these mature technologies like solar and wind. It needs to move to sort of better tech, batteries, for example, which India's been talking about for many years right now, but we don't still seem to have a system that's even of a reasonable scale in place that will allow for the entire country to learn. Right? So that is something that we think really needs to happen. And more importantly, DRE, right? We see that the Kusum scheme, the Shrishti scheme, all of these have been announced, but then there's a lot of there's not enough clarity around what that pace of uptake is going to be, and many states are sort of in the lurch on how do I really promote these decentralized forms of energy. So a clear opportunity here again for India to sort of divert all of that money that we spoke about, right, which they shouldn't be giving away towards coal-based electricity or towards LPG to the non-deserving, and move it in favor of spending here in the renewable energy sector. The next slide. And I think that's over to Bala there for the role of coal. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thanks again for taking the time. So I would be going through the remainder of the presentation. So the remaining kind of big fuel that we haven't discussed so far is, of course, coal. And as Chris mentioned while narrating through that video, the subsidies for coal has remained pretty consistent since 2014 at about the range between 11 to 15,000 crores. The two biggest subsidies for coal are the first one being the concessional GST rate enjoyed by coal, which is currently at 5% as opposed to 18%, which is being levied on other minerals. The other big subsidy is the non-compliance with coal washing regulations, which is currently at 1,000 crores. It must be noted that this non-compliance is an important subsidy for the fact that this data captures only till FY19, but following this, as you might know, not a lot of the plants in the Delhi NCR region who were supposed to meet the air pollution targets met with it. As a result, they have not been complying with the air pollution norms, and that would also count as a subsidy. So can you please go to the next slide? Okay, so at the start of the project design, we wanted to understand the benefit, the impact of coal in India's economy. And the fundamental reasoning behind that was that coal was in the news for having a lot of non-performing assets, as well as not having met the air pollution standards. So to go about this, what we did was to look at the benefits, which is the taxes, special charges, as well as the costs associated with subsidies and social costs. A bit more on this. So for the taxes, what we looked at is the central and state level taxes paid by Coal India Limited and coal provided by not Coal India Limited for coal which is used in the power sector. On special charges, what we did was basically look at the overcharging done on coal freight, which is being done by the Indian Railways to cross-subsidize passenger fare. We also looked at subsidies, which is something that is part of the core work. And finally, we also looked at social costs. This was categorized into two. One is on air pollution. The other one is social costs due to GHG emissions. For air pollution, what we looked at is the study done by urban emissions. And we estimated the costs associated with premature loss of life, as well as work loss days. For the social costs, what we did was to look at the impact of climate change on India based on a study done by Ricky et al. And the lower estimate was that each ton of CO2 emitted would have a rough impact of about $49 on India. Can you please go to the next slide? So we completely acknowledge the fact that assigning financial value to social costs is a bit tricky. But what we try to do was to be as conservative as possible. And it must be noted that this is kind of a simple analysis, and we would definitely welcome welcome efforts to build on this by looking at other social costs which has not been captured, such as water pollution, land degradation, deaths in mines, as well as the kind of benefits linked with jobs created in the coal sector. But here's the summary of the numbers. As you can see, the tax revenue was in the ballpark of around 50,000 crore. And the cross subsidies done for the railway sector is in the 16,000 crore ballpark. Subsidies are also about the same, but in the opposite direction, of course. And finally, the social cost is a staggering 390,000 crore. Out of this, about 40,000 crore is linked to premature loss of life because of the air pollution as well as the work loss days. It must be noted that even if only the kind of price or social cost of carbon was set to 1/10 of what we did in analysis, it will still be in the same direction, which is net negative cost to the economy. And and of course, we have already taken pretty conservative numbers. So this is crucial in the current context, in the sense, as the pandemic pans out, there is a good chance, or there is a possibility of a recurrence of non-performing assets in the thermal power sector, as well as there is the need for meeting the air pollution or or rather the pollution control technology needs to be installed in the thermal power plants. And this is something that will probably come in the news in October, November. As you might know, Delhi's pollution makes international news every year. So while recovery is planned, these factors must also be considered, and it must be understood as what is the true impact of coal on the Indian economy, and we believe it is pretty negative. Going on. So yeah, can you go to so that brings us to the final slide, essentially, which is the recommendations that we have. So we wanted to give these recommendations with the context of the recovery measures that will be planned by the government following the pandemic. They are the first kind of broad suggestion that we have is that to maintain and increase ambition to shift public resources to clean energy for all the reasons that was listed before by the other presenters. Within that is to resist demands for new oil and gas subsidies, as well as target these subsidies in a way such that only the deserving get it. This is alludes to back what Karthik said. Along with this, we also need to carefully adapt RE subsidies and provide it to the technology which are emerging, as well as grid balancing and storage. We also need to address the full cost of coal, because currently it is pretty stark. We also need to closely monitor and adapt EV subsidies, because they are small, but we do have ambitious targets. While they are growing, we need to make sure they are in line with our targets. And to close this, we need to develop formal reporting structures on subsidies. This also already mentioned about SDG 12.C.1. So we need to monitor, evaluate, and understand these subsidies so that we can be sure that it is in line with our objectives. And this is again a recommendation that we make based on this research. So can you go to the next slide, please? That brings us to the end of the presentation. But before I hand over the mic to the moderator, I wanted to quickly demonstrate the data visualization portal that we have built along with the study. Right. So this is the data portal that we have built for ease of understanding the subsidies and kind of knowing what has gone into the study. So on the landing page, you can see the broad trends, and you can filter through the various energy types, and you can switch between INR crore or USD billion, whichever one you're more comfortable with. We've also set it to the first three, like the last 3 financial years, but you can go through and include all of them. When you click on download data, you'll get an Excel file which has all the information which has been uploaded to this data portal. If you also wish to report on this or to wish to share this data portal, you can embed the graph on your websites. This is the video that was shown earlier in the presentation. And as you scroll down, you can click through the various sectors. I'll click renewables. And this takes you to a separate page where again you have the trends, this time with a bit more of filter features on the types of subsidies or who benefits. We also have another graph which describes the policies that we have used to calculate the subsidies. And if you wish to find out more, you can just click on this and you get a short description on what are these subsidies. And finally, we have the about section, where we've given some more context on where we got this data from, what are the subsidies and how it has been calculated. And if you are interested, there is link to more reading material as well. I guess that brings us to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, and over to you now.
Thank you, Bala. Thank you, Chris, Karthik. I have some questions coming at me. So maybe I'll pose the first one to Chris. There's a question from Vedita. Why are we taking 2014 as the base year for sharing the subsidy findings? And was there some legislation in 2014 that brought about some major changes in these subsidies directionally or otherwise?
That's a great question. And I'm going to give you the honest answer, which is it wasn't chosen for some specific kind of reason of grand design. Like I mentioned, the database was first created in 2017. And we wanted to make sure that we had a good spread of years, and we felt like the most recent years are the most important. So at that point, we had data from financial year 2014 through to financial year 2016. So we had 3 years, and that seemed like a good number over which to observe trends. So since that point, we have been updating it, and as a result, 2014 still just remains the first year in the database. So that's the honest answer. I think that fortunately, I think partly through luck, it is actually quite a good year. One of the biggest policy changes that affected the fossil fuel subsidies took place in that year, and also was just before there was a big drop in world oil prices temporarily. So looking back, it's actually quite fortunate, and we can see some of the impacts from oil price fluctuations starting from 2014, but also some of the biggest energy policy changes as well.
Thank you. There's one more question from Vaibhav. I think Bala, I'll pose this to you. He asks if you can share a bit more about the basis for a social cost calculation.
Sure. What we did, so the process that we followed was to look at the literature and try to understand what kind of studies have already been done. We are very aware that any kind of numbers that we put in will have like caveats and assumptions built into it. So we tried looking at as many sources as possible, and we realized that there were only a few that we could justifiably put into the report, that it had sufficient reporting. So based on that, we picked on the two ones which I described, one being air pollution, other being GHG emissions. And to take a step further back, why we wanted to consider social costs, because it was the fair thing to do. If you were to understand the impact of coal on the economy, you also need to understand what the people are currently paying and what has not been built into the finances surrounding thermal power plants. So based on this, for the air pollution, what we looked at is the premature loss of lives associated with thermal power plants. We estimated based on the lower, we took a conservative estimate on the value of life based on insurance prices. These have been detailed in the annexure in the report, and if you I can share that with you and you can take a look. And for the social cost of Karun, what we did, as I told before in the presentation, was to take a lower estimate on what impact climate change can have on the Indian economy, and use that along with the total emissions from the thermal power sector in India. It also must be noted that the values presented was for one financial year, and it's not aggregated over a period of time. So this was for the financial year, which is April 1st, 2017 to March 31st, 2018. So I hope I've clarified. I can go into more detail, but I guess we can move on to more questions and I can share the information to you later. Thank you.
Thanks. We've got another question from Badwe. He's asking, in the recent past, Government of India has taken initiative to get away from LPG for household cooking. to get away from LPG subsidy, that is. What are your observations regarding this initiative, and was this initiative proven to be correct, or are still further measures required from the government? And he wants to a little more elaboration on what we recommend for those further measures. So maybe Karthik, do you want to take this question?
Sure, Vibhuti. Thank you for the question. So I guess the quick answer is the initiatives that the government has taken really were two, right? One of them was, rather maybe three. One was weeding out, illegal connections. I think they managed to, take out close to about 3 crore connections, right? That where there were duplicates, as a result of the KYC process that they carried out. They then did the Give It Up campaign. I think at last count, I think it was a little over 1 crore people giving up their LPG subsidy, but that was of course voluntary. There was no sort of forced this thing. And I think there was also this plan. I'm not sure to what extent this is actually materialized. People earning over incomes of I think 10 lakh rupees a year were I think deemed to sort of be not eligible. I've tried to look in the past for the evidence of whether this has been enforced clearly. But again, given that there is a very poor database around who's paying taxes and who's not, and to what extent, I can't imagine that that would have really resulted in too much success. So really, I think the
Sorry, Karthik, I think we lost you in the last sentence. Do you want to come back and finish?
Sorry, I was saying that I think the Give It Up campaign and I think weeding out of the connections was the biggest step. The income tax based assessment of who deserves and not is probably not as much of a success. But otherwise, right, I think Government of India ever since the prices sort of really dropped, and I think with the health scheme and the Ujjwala scheme, right, have just expanded the access to LPG across the board. So subsidy levels are technically going to go up for a while. And if you look at alternatives to LPG, for example, if you look at cities where piped natural gas is being supplied, that's a good way to sort of, have people get onto new fuels where the subsidy is actually not there, right? So PNG is there's no explicit subsidy on PNG itself, unlike LPG. And if many cities were to sort of really move the PNG way, it's freeing up LPG to be sort of moved to rural areas where the subsidy can go to people who actually need it. So I guess these are the transitions that maybe are currently underway, but there's been no clear indication of the government to go after people who don't deserve it, right? Based on, for example, their wealth, right? Whether they have air conditioners and cars in their possession, and does that mean that you deserve it or not? These are sort of propositions that we've been given to the government, to various committees. There was a committee constituted under Jalan to actually look at actively how can the government take back LPG subsidy in 2014 when the prices were sky high. But unfortunately, I don't think there was any stomach to take up those initiatives because they didn't want to sort of exclude anybody who would otherwise be deemed, sort of eligible for the subsidy itself. Hope that answered it to some extent.
Thanks, Karthik. I think, Chris, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, just quickly to add a few points on LPG. I think LPG is a really complicated fuel because, as you saw, it's a fossil fuel. And the subsidies are really quite large. It's a large share of the remaining oil and gas subsidies. But obviously, it's really important. People need it to access clean cooking. And in addition to what Karthik said, I think one of the things that we see right now is there's actually still affordability problems. So there's quite a lot of data that shows that for the lowest income households, they're struggling to afford LPG. Sometimes it's just because even the subsidized cost of a cylinder is too high for them. There's also issues to do with subsidy design, where the loan scheme that was created through the Ujjwala connection policy basically requires people to pay back their loan by actually buying LPG at full market prices until they pay it back, which for really low-income households is a big problem. So I think this is part actually of what's at the heart of this targeting issue, because one of the reforms that has been happening over the past 2 years for LPG is really small monthly price increases. When oil prices were high, the government was actually marginally increasing the price of subsidized LPG month by month, and it was making it harder and harder for affordability, but not really making any headway in the total costs. So targeting matters because the per unit price that you can afford to subsidize for the whole population is unfortunately actually sometimes not big enough of a subsidy to help the people who need it most, and it's still way too big for people who don't need the assistance. So I think just to flag all those sensitivities, any reform for LPG subsidies needs to be done really carefully to make sure that it doesn't hurt people who are most vulnerable. And right now, I think the lack of capacity for targeting has been a big challenge in that respect.
Okay, Chris, while I still have you there, there's another question I think that we can flow into from that topic. Question from Deepak, who's asking, wouldn't it be more informative to show taxes versus subsidy from each sector, as it will show which sectors can support subsidy over a longer term?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. We would love to do it. The reason we don't is just because of capacity constraints right now. This database is something that we try to grow every year we do it. So after the first round, we managed to add electric vehicles when we did our update last year. This time we've done this special module on coal, which looks at issues more kind of comprehensively, including taxes. So if we could look at all taxes, tax revenue, not just the taxes that are linked to subsidies across energy types, that would be great. And I think it's a good ambition for us to try to make it more holistic. Other things that we would like to address going forwards are also public finance and SOE capital investments, as these are other kind of big categories where public money is being used to influence the energy sector, and right now we can't capture all of that. So a very welcome question. And obviously, if there are other organizations who've got expertise in any of these areas, we really believe in collaboration and think that this kind of work is stronger when it's done jointly. So if folks have got bright ideas on anything like that, don't hesitate to reach out.
All right, thank you. We have a lot of questions flowing in. So if I can request the authors to please sort of be brief and direct the participants to maybe more resources available in the report or on the data portal, that would really help us to get through a lot of questions in the short time we have. I think the next question is on electric vehicles. Vibhuti, if I can pose this question to you, the question is how long until electric vehicles may become fully adopted in India? And also with the high operational costs, how would one justify them?
Thanks, Shruti. As far as electric vehicles are concerned, I think there has been intention to kind of shift to electric vehicles from the conventional sources fairly rapidly, but I think it's going to take a while to do that. Government had initially agreed to do that by 2030, that at least 30% of our fleet would be electric vehicles based. But given the higher cost, as your other question about the operational cost, I think the way to go about is to kind of first convert public transport into electric vehicles, I think, and that's what most of the states are adopting. We have seen a lot of policies being implemented and announced by different states in, pushing more and more electric vehicles as part of the public system. And we have also seen increasingly sales happening in the two-wheeler and the three-wheeler market. While for the four-wheelers, it's still quite expensive, but as soon as, we'll see a price drop, there will be a lot of people out of, climate concern or out of, to begin with, it was more of a, status symbol that you own an electric vehicle, but gradually it's going to be more climate concern and people will be adopting more and more electric vehicles into the system, but that needs a lot of government measures, and government has been supporting through, tax exemptions and, promoting through subsidies, the manufacturers, consumers, and infrastructure throughout the value chain to build up that system that, we can kind of rapidly shift to electric vehicles.
There is a question on EVs, but I've lost track of that question here. But maybe let's jump to, there are quite a few questions on Uday that I'd like to club together. And then maybe we can come back to the question on EVs once I find it. Sorry about that. So on Uday, there are a few questions that I'll club together. Some of them are saying, how will the Uday 1 and 2 schemes help reduce the AT&C losses? What would be the timeline to see some of these results? Second part of this question is, how will this affect renewable adoption in the mix? And the third part of this question is, just states who've been adopting or sort of working on Uday, have they been considered part of our study? And what kind of subsidies numbers have we seen for this? And if not in our study, is there any other resources that you can share about that?
Shruti, can I take a first crack at that?
Sure.
So, hi, this is Karthik here from CEEW. So, as many of you out there might know, Government of India has not been formally publishing, results around consolidated lists, what exactly the financial status of utilities is. There used to be a publication from MO that has stopped since 2015-16. So, for the purpose of this particular effort, we actually had to individually go through and trawl individual, annual revenue reports and audited books to find out what exactly the figure is. So, the bulk of what you're seeing in this year's figures, right, of the 70,000 crore, is really state subsidies that have actually been explicitly said. I mean, state governments giving it to DISCOM, saying, here, this is the amount of subsidy I'm giving you to ensure that farmers and consumers, like for example, poorer sections of households, right? In some cases, it's directly targeted these groups. For them, this is the amount of subsidy that you will need to ensure that you keep the prices at the levels at which we've told you to, in effect, right? Because we all know that there is a political play in the way tariffs are set in the various states, and they're not actually set based on cost recovery metrics. So Uday really did not have such a large role to play in this year's subsidy figures. But that said, over the last 3 years, when I think the scheme was basically rolled out and unfolding, a lot of the debt that was being taken over by the states contributed to this enlarged subsidy. And to the question that you asked regarding what about Uday 2, I think there's been no formal comment on Uday 2, even though they've named the scheme. Again, it's very difficult to sort of say whether Uday has worked or not. By all measures, I think even MOP has accepted that Uday 1 has not functioned as efficiently as they would have liked to. Because at the core of it, they've not addressed some of the fundamental issues for the DISCOMs, barring things like, for example, regular tariff increases and such. But if you look at key states like UP, right, which are sort of benchmarks for how the system is likely to go, fundamental reform around billing and collection and improving all of that did not really happen over the last few years. And also, power purchase costs have gone up so much that it's sort of persisted that vicious cycle that Indian DISCOMs are caught in. Renewable energy offers a solution, but given that their share in the overall mix is still very low, over the last 3 years we basically saw a massive jump in overall cost of supply, which basically undid any gains that the states had to have by virtue of not having to pay finance costs, which was the largest reprieve that Uday actually gave them. Vibhuti, maybe over to you for additional comments.
Yeah, no, you covered most of it. So basically, it's very difficult to comment on the timeline by when we'll see, the ideal scenarios of AT&C losses, as well as, the financial losses going down by DISCOM. So Uday 1 has resulted in positive benefits, through debt restructuring and all for few states, and AT&C losses have gone down and the revenue gap has reduced, but not to the extent, given the expenditure that has been done to revive these distribution companies. As far as Uday 2 is concerned, I think more or less it was kind of streamlined. It was about to be announced, but in the current situation, I think instead of improving the fundamentals of distribution companies, most of that allocated money, again, it's my view, it's not something which has been kind of come out from the government sources. But most of these sources which were initially allocated for Uday 2 are now going to be reviving again the financial DISCOMs to deal with this COVID-19 situation where demand has dropped down substantially. And then, there are issues of, force majeure being levied by producers as well as distribution companies or from the consumers to do a fixed charges. So there's a lot of moving pieces currently in light of COVID-19 situation, and my fear and sense is that a lot of the Uday 2 money will be used currently to deal with the current situation rather than the amount kind of things which they had outlined to be part of Uday 2, which was which the first thing was to have more and more smart metering, which can help in improving billing and collection for the DISCOMs, which was one of the key reasons for loss.
Thanks, Vibhuti. I know you mentioned this in passing, but there are a few more questions on this. So while I have you here, if I can, sorry, just ask you to stress a little more on this. There's a question on what incentives are we giving to discoms to bring in institutional reforms, or even restructuring the power procurement and retail tariff structures?
See, these are all part of DISCOM reform measures. So in our current study, while our overall recommendation is for improving targeting and helping, the government shift to more cleaner energy sources, but as far as these technical and operational performance indicators are concerned, it will be a kind of state level recommendation, because every state, are at different level of reforms. And as I said, some of the fundamental issues are on billing and collection and timely tariff revision. So having smart meters in place and other indicators which can help in improving the operational and financial performance have to be built in gradually. Karthik, do you want to add here?
No, not really. But in terms of incentives, right? In the first round, when Uday was introduced, right, there was of course preferential allocation of surplus power from the national pool for states that would actually sort of abide by some of this. There was also, I think, preferential allocation of resources, financial. To carry this out if they met the targets that were given. So all of these were obviously in place, but the challenge I think with us doing a postmortem is really that data has not been made available at a pan-India level across the states, right? So even though the Uday portal there says a lot of things, seemingly some of them even real time or on a weekly basis, right? There was no way of sort of really going back and looking at data from the discoms that justified all of this. Even today, if you go and look at distribution company filings, they're at odds with what is actually reported in the Uday portal itself. So, unless we sort of sort out this big transparency issue of data in the power sector, where there are different accounts that are submitted effectively to different people in the system, right? We can't reconcile these numbers and actually say that the difference is happening. So let's all strive towards that, and I think the subsidies work that we're doing here is one part of it. But I think tracking overall distribution company performance much more closely and getting access to that data is a bigger part of the story, which we haven't quite delved into, but hopefully, we'll get to that, in the later course of this year itself. We have another module on basically targeting of electricity subsidies planned as part of the work for later this year.
Thank you. I'm conscious we've got 7 more minutes and we have a few more questions to get through. There's a question on biomass and on state-specific analysis. Chris, do you want to take this question? It asks, what steps should the government take to impart a sustainable boost to the biomass-based bioenergy sector in India? And a part of that question is, what can we do about sort of increasing the investments in that space? So can we play around with giving it zero GST or some kind of a moratorium on borrowings? Yeah, and then once you finish that, maybe I'll ask that question again then.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great question. And I'm not going to be able to answer it directly. But what I can say is this. Usually with analysis and subsidies, we think about different stages in analysis. So first step is transparency, right? Just what are the subsidies and where are they going? Second step is then policy evaluation. So of the policies that exist, are they achieving their impacts or not? And then third step is reform. If you think a policy needs to get changed or there's just a gap where there should be a policy, what do you need to do to overcome bottlenecks? Our report that we're launching today is really step 1. And obviously, it's been a huge job just collecting this data about what the subsidies are and how big they are. We haven't been able to evaluate every single one of them to kind of offer the sorts of insights that you're interested in biomass. I think we really want to encourage people to do it. So we want this data to be a public good that will help answer the sorts of questions that you're asking. I can say that the data show that the biomass subsidies are very small. I can also say that I think in theory, what an economist's dream would be a subsidy policy that is pretty technology neutral, right? We'd like to kind of promote competition between energy types. I think it isn't clear what the right energy types are to address sustainability challenges, and many energy types have one kind of downside or another. But in reality, that's not really what's happening. I don't think there's any country in the world that's managed to create this economist's dream policy that will create some magical flexible incentive across lots of different energy types at the same time. So I'd say realistically that probably there does need to be a biomass specific set of policies, and I'd take a look at the data, see what you think. I think in terms of your questions about the sorts of tools that are useful, hopefully the database is a great resource for you there as well. You can see all of the other sorts of subsidies that have been used for other energy types, both fossil and renewable in India. And I think that can also help create bridges to comparisons to talk about what might make sense for biomass.
Thank you. Chris, I think there have been a few questions just about state level analysis and central government subsidies. So if you can maybe just clarify a little bit on how this report sort of disaggregates the two, and where and which sectors does it go into state specific analysis of subsidies?
Thanks. That's another great question. So the majority of the data in our database are central government policies only. And again, this is just a data volume challenge, right? India has got 29 states. So it would be a lot of data to go through. The big exception to this is the electricity subsidies. They're granted at a state level, but almost every state does them, and they're so big and so important, and they have been reported on. There was, at least back when we started this exercise in 2017, there was relatively good transparency on them. So we've included them because not doing so would be a major omission. As Kartik mentioned, there's actually been a decrease in transparency around electricity subsidies. So for the latest update, we had to manually go through tariff orders for every single state in the country to work out what the subsidies are. And often the tariff orders don't necessarily give a kind of fixed estimate, so we need to kind of do calculations with different points. So that's the extent to which we cover state level policies right now. When we did the first version of this report back in 2017, we actually looked at some states to give an example of some of the data gaps that might be missing around state level policies. So if you're curious to see that, I would encourage you to take a look back at that original paper from 2017, which gives some insights here, but this is another area where I think we really welcome contributions from others. You know, if there are people doing state level work on these issues who want to fill in those gaps, we would be delighted to support them and to see if we can make sure we're doing it in a way where it's consistent and we're using the same definitions and terms and approach and so on.
Okay, I think we're 1 minute away from an hour, and I can squeeze in one last question. Ruthie, can I pose this question to you? It's from Dhruvak. He asks, I'm going to pose a question, blah, blah, blah. Sorry, you suggested increasing taxes and reducing subsidies on oil, but what impact do you expect of this when prices increase, given that OPEC Plus is now cutting production?
Sure. I mean, this is quite relevant in today's circumstances. I don't know if most of you are aware that government did use this as a lever, when the oil prices went down very recently, and the government increased its excise duty taxes on both petrol and diesel, while the ultimate prices for the retail consumer level wasn't reduced to the extent we have seen the drop in oil prices. And it was as high as 8 rupees were increased in the last quarter. And that's where, the government, as I said, has used it very beautifully to kind of, use this as a source of increasing their revenue when the oil prices have crashed. And as soon as the oil prices starts going up, which we are seeing now that with OPEC and Russia reaching an agreement to cut down the production, we'll see some again, strengthening of the prices on oil happening soon. And the government can reduce the increase in excise taxes, which it did, but the overall impact on the consumer will be minimized because the government will decrease the taxes, which it has done now. And if you look at historically in the year 2019 as well, when the oil prices increase above 60 USD per barrel, government again used excise taxes and reduced it by 2.5 rupees per liter and to compensate and minimize the impact of increasing the price for the ultimate consumers. So they have used this excise tax, and in the future again, when the oil prices will start strengthening again, we'll see government reducing the taxes, which might reduce their revenues, but they would have by now increased their revenues quite substantially. Though the volumes have gone down, so the increase might not have been to that extent, but the ultimate impact on the consumer won't happen.
Thank you so much, Vibhuti. That was really well put. I guess we're on top of the hour, so we have to wrap up now, but I'm very excited to carry this discussion forward with all of you. So please reach out to us on our Twitter handle. It's @GlobalSubsidies, and we'll look forward to answering all your questions over there. Thank you so much again for taking time and participating today.